It's Friday, December 10th, 2021, and I'm in Toronto with Charles Smith and Kevin Ormsby, who are the leaders of the CIPAMO, and they'll explain a little bit in a second what that is. But what we're going to do today is, earlier in the morning, both of you spoke very eloquently about a publication that just came out called Living in the Skin I Am In. And you talked a lot about it, so you don't need to repeat that because I'll insert some of that into this episode. But since you're both here and you've produced what I consider to be a very successful event about IBPOC issues in and around the climate, the COVID recovery, but also the climate emergency and other related issues, I'm interested in your points of view on what this event has brought to you and how you see things moving forward. And yesterday, Charles, we were talking outside here about there are many issues, but what are the priority issues? What are the most important in communities who have been underserved and who are feeling the need to have a much stronger voice? But first, maybe just introduce yourselves. I'll start with Kevin.
I'm Kevin Ormsby. I'm the Program Manager for Cultural Pluralism in the Arts Movement Ontario, CIPAMO for short, and I'm also the Artistic Director of a dance company called Cache Dance. Most of my work exists in a multidisciplinary format, taking invitations and information from all the artistic practices into what becomes a dance performance or a dance production. I'm really passionate about my work with CIPAMO because it intersects with my other passion around writing and or research and or support in arts administration and in the arts sector itself.
Charles Smith.
Yeah, I'm Charles Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Cultural Pluralism Arts Movement Ontario. I'm also a poet, and I run a group or work with a group called the Wind in the Leaves Collective, which is a multidisciplinary performing group based on my poetry. And with CIPAMO, the whole notion for me is really revolving around that M in CIPAMO, movement, because obviously we can't do this by ourselves. We need to collaborate. We need to find allies. We need to follow those who are in leadership on certain areas and let them know that we are very much involved in the process. And how we bring people together to share perspectives on what are fundamental issues right now in not just the arts ecology, but the relationship of the arts ecology to society. For me, the arts give peoples an imagination. It gives peoples identities. And right now, with CIPAMO, we think this is really important because, there's been such incredible erasure of many identities, beginning with indigenous peoples, persons of African descent, and other racialized and marginalized peoples. We feel it's important to make sure, and that's our publications and our resources, that these voices are out there now in real time, and because these are folks who are working today to have this imagination as part of the Canadian identity.
Well, we'll listen to a first excerpt of your speaking earlier this morning now.
One, Living in the Skin I'm In, which is basically to invite artists to talk about what is happening in their world as indigenous artists, as artists of color, predominantly, and to also include tools. So we have a number of toolkits that are in that document that we're still working with today with organizations on. And as you'll see in that link I've put into the chat room, documentation has been something that we have considered to be critical since our beginnings and continues up to this day. So whether it's Jane Marsland's work or Kevin's work around actually what does collaboration look like within an equitable framework with organizations that are large, who want to work with indigenous communities, who want to work with indigenous artists, artists of color, the deaf and disabled, what are the frameworks in which those kinds of relationships might take place? Looking at the history of equity and the relative access of resources that some organizations have and others don't. So that's been critical to our work. And depending on where we are, whether it's around helping out legal organizations that are doing work with artists, as we did with public legal education and outreach last year, or working with black artists, as we have in this recent publication, Living in the Skin I'm In, inviting people to share. And that's the notion, Kevin, that you've created around, retitling our gatherings as Gathering Divergence, bringing in other voices so we can amplify the expressions in the field. So it might be useful if I can throw it back to you to talk about that for a bit.
Sure. In thinking about what was going to be was the convening, actually the gathering, it was called before. I, with a communications degree, I thought about what would be really unique and beautiful about marketing it as a conference and a festival. It used to be a 1.5 day convening of different artists, arts organizations on a particular theme or subject matter. And in searching, convergence is to literally think about putting everything into one particular funnel of an idea. And it doesn't really reflect the idea of what pluralism is, which is a multiplicity of ideas in conversation with each other. So for me, I began to look into the meaning and ways in which people were talking about divergence. And the way in which divergence was a multiplicity of ideas that held space together, but that was in conversation with each other, where convergence was putting them all in a funnel, assuming that they would have the same conversation. So that led to us renaming the first year. We're renaming it the Gathering Divergence Multi-Arts Festival and Conference. Also, some of the things that we knew we wanted to do from the very beginning was showcase IBPOC artists, indigenous Black people of color artists, who were not getting sort of access to mainstream spaces and places. And because we started in that particular place, and because we had a sort of air in with presenters, we wanted to make sure that we were becoming a catalyst for those particular artists and arts organizations, and provide a space for them to arrive at either showcases, presentations, etc. And then we thought, well, we might as well do that too. We might as well become presenters. We might as well, create a budget every year that goes into two conferences, bold move as well, to actually do 2 of these in a year, 1 in the spring, 1 in the fall. And it first started with just showcasing different artists. And then I had to go back to one of our first resource material around collaborating and around what artists were saying, and they wanted and need to be showcased. And from there, I thought about, well, we can do a curation arm, which we still do, curate some artists and arts organizations. And we can then have an RFS, which is a request for submissions, where various artists from across the country now can also put in a request to be submitted or to be presented or to provide a workshop. And it goes through an assessment committee, which is a selection committee basically of persons from the community, persons from our IBPOC organization group, which is a Pluralism for Organizational Change group that we run now with organizations in training over 2 years. And then also with myself as sort of the selection committee chair, just prepping all the material and sending it out to the selection committee to then decide and select who will be also receiving an opportunity to showcase themselves and their work as part of the Multi-Arts Festival and Conference.
And now I'll ask Kevin if you could talk a bit about your role as programmer. You brought together, I had the honor of doing a panel this morning that will be episode 93 probably of this podcast, because we want to get these words out. But as programmer of the event, what were your intentions or your hopes? And maybe explain a little bit what these 3 days are about.
Sure. The Gathering Divergence Multi-Arts Festival and Conference is something that we dreamed up from our smaller convenings we used to have over the past couple of years. And this one, every conference and festival has a theme. This one is Art in a Time of Healing and Planetary Renewal. And so everything that we're speaking about was looking at how artists and arts organizations were coming out of COVID. What was their recovery? What were some of the challenges that are being faced? We hear conversations a lot around, as programmer as well, around this idea of back to normal. And I beg to question, was it ever normal before? What's the better? Was it best before? And so for us, we wanted to have a conversation around the state of how artists and arts organizations are emerging out of a pandemic, and then also what it means in a time of planetary renewal. Given also the racial reckoning that we knew that was going on, we felt that there were assumptions being made about how we would begin again. And so we wanted to make sure that we had different panels and focus around this idea of starting back, but also addressing what was happening to artists and to organizations prior to the pandemic that led to some of the further marginalization of IBPOC artists and the further under-resourcing of IBPOC artists. And so how do we begin to address that so that can be shifted or changed emerging out of a pandemic?
Well, we'll listen to some more of your talk this morning about documentation, and then I'll just ask Charles to talk a bit about the book itself, because it's a jewel, it seems to me, of a collection of really important voices. So we'll listen to that.
So it will grow, hopefully, and it will change and it will shift. But along the way, we're really curious about documenting. So, you know, what we're trying out this year is how breakout rooms happen, but it's not going so well. Past 2 days, it's interesting because we're not all in a virtual space. So breakout rooms become a little bit more challenging as we're in both a hybrid space of being in theater here at Aki Theater and then online. But in all those breakout rooms, in all the sessions we have, in all the conversations we have, it's important to document. It's important to see everyone that participates as subject matter experts and begin to amplify their thoughts and their ideas into things that we do. And that's basically how this came about, which is our latest publication, Living in the Skin I'm In, Experiential Learnings, Approaches, and Considerations Towards Anti-Black Racism in the Arts. And basically, again, it's a compilation of different articles, different persons' viewpoints on some of the challenges, some of the ways in which they've been working in the arts. And we see it as a way of also then animating space differently. Animating space online by having a resource for it to be online, but also a physical copy that persons who are interested could purchase and have it within their library. So it also has an ISBN number and everything as well. As we're beginning to think about how we can begin to document the contribution of IBPOC artists and arts organizations across the country. And we know that's been not been documented as well, and their voice has not been amplified in the ways that it should. And they have a long, long history of work and participation within the sector as well.
And so, Charles, what is this publication, and how does it fit into the discourse? I mean, it sounds like you wanted these voices to be together in the publication and to be available.
Yeah, and I want to tie it to a question you raised earlier about what's priorities and so on. I mean, to me, if we look at this publication, obviously these are voices that are being unleashed. Some of them have been around for some time, like Diane Roberts or Braden Blyden Taylor, Robert Ball, McKevin and myself. Others are new. And what's really important is that we're all coming together at this point in time to talk about the history of Black presence in the arts, which is tied to Black presence in Canada. And to me, this brings about a fundamental issue that's foundational about how we look at priorities. We always say IBPOC, Indigenous Black People of Color, and there's a reason why. We are on Indigenous land. We say this all the time. And what part of it's got to go beyond saying to honoring that if we're going to really talk about priorities, we have to talk about what are the fundamental elements, the foundations of the current system we live in. Those fundamental elements are the taking of land from its original inhabitants and the dragging over of people for free labor for 4 centuries. That has to be priorities, because basically our society is built on that. And without that, we wouldn't be here in this way. So that's really quite important in terms of it. And to have a publication like this shows that while the general or the mainstream society, the white supremacist society, has tried to act like we don't exist, we persist, as they say, nonetheless. And so this publication is further evidence of that. It's not the only publication we have, but certainly it's one that we've focused solely on Black voices. Because given the COVID crisis and the issues of anti-Black racism that have emerged rather ugly during this time, it was really important to put this together and provide those opportunities.
And how and where is it available?
Well, people can certainly get it from us, and that you can get to either Kevin, programming at sapamo.org, or to me, executive at sapamo.org. Or info at sapamo.org. And those are all the ways. And of course, there's a $20 fee for it. I mean, it's a beautiful publication. And believe me, $20 is not exactly the cost of it, but we want to make it available as much as possible.
Well, I'll put those links in the episode notes. Kevin, I know you have to run an event here. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
I think it'd be more than $20. We haven't figured out the sort of mailing costs yet, but it might be $30 just to cover the mailing costs as part of that as well.
Fair enough.
But I think what I'd love to say is, for anyone who's interested in either presenting, being curated, and or submitting RFS to the gathering in the future, that they should also look at follow our Facebook page, where they can get more information about the next festival, and can also send myself at programming@sapamo.org suggestions for performances that they would like to do as part of the festival.
Well, that's great, because the audience for this podcast is worldwide. So there are people who don't know your organization and might never come to Toronto ever, but they I hope, like me, they're happy that it exists and that it plays, I think, a really critical role in discourse. I mean, what I heard today, Santi Smith and my colleague Anthony Girofalis Auger and Devin Hardy speak with passion about the issues, and yet I still feel there's a gap. I felt there was not a black person on the committee, on the panel, and I'm not blaming anyone, but I can feel absences, and so that just means we need more conversations and inclusion, but let's do that. We can do it in so many ways. Sometimes it's government-led, sometimes it's community-led, and sometimes it's a partnership between different interests and foundations, because, like you said, there's a lot of common ground and common experience. I was telling the breakout groups were a lot of fun today after the panel, and at one point Santi was talking about what a calendar is, the sort of ecological calendar, and she gave examples. And these are beautiful concepts, right? An ecological calendar. It's like we should all have one. But I mentioned that there's a group in Calgary called Traction who got a Canada Council grant to do some art and climate work, and they're working with an Indigenous woman, Chantal. I don't remember her last name, but I'm interviewing them soon, and they'll be able to have a chance. But one of the things they're doing is that they're working by Indigenous region, so by language or by a traditional language. So instead of, say, Manitoba, you would say Northern Cree, or you would say Anishinaabe, something, I don't know them very well, but isn't that an interesting way to map how we travel, how we talk about place and space? And if we can start having different ways of thinking and doing, even if it's, and not just land acknowledgement, because that's one, but there's so many other ways just to think differently, to decolonize. I'm not saying decolonization is fun, but I had a lot of pleasure in just hearing about these different ways of naming territories and spaces.
Yes.
The potential there is so interesting to move forward together.
Yeah, and that's an interesting aspect about the impact of COVID in particular. So now, as Kevin mentioned, here we are experimenting with hybrid space and so on. One of the things that we had to do during COVID was actually shut down to refigure out, what the heck are we doing? I mean, largely Sapamo, through the wisdom of various funders, I won't mention any names, we exist on project grants. And project grants, as we know, and we heard from Shannon Litzenberger the other day, produce a product, by a deadline, et cetera. So without being able to gather people in physical space, we had to figure out, okay, how do we do that? And we had to rethink everything. And one of the things that was really beneficial about that was saying, all right, the digital age presents certain opportunities. Zoom, which we're on now. And if you look at our videos, you'll see a lot of Zoom sessions that we held to talk about issues and to document where artists were coming from in terms of the impact of COVID on particularly historically marginalized artists and arts communities. So we held sessions that looked at Indigenous arts today. We had people like the current chair of Canada Council, Jesse Wente, on that, like the curator at the AGO, Wanda Nanabush, on that, and others as well who are very active in the Indigenous arts community, from the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance to the Indigenous Curatorial Collective. We also held a session with Black artists to talk about what are the impacts now given COVID, et cetera. And these things have been documented. So Zoom or online has given us another tool by which we can gather these voices, record them, edit them, put them back out there. Because it really is, in terms of what our values are, is
Yes, we agree that anti-racism is important. Yes, we agree that anti-oppression is important. Yes, we agree that equity is important. Yes, we agree that sovereignty is important for indigenous peoples in particular, and that decolonization is really important. But to us, these are tools to get toward a new society, to transform the world in which we live, to get out of, if I can refer to the panel that we had the other day that led off this conference, to get out of the social, historical, economic trap that we're currently in that forces us to compete with each other, that forces us, as Peru was saying, to ignore the land and what the land is trying to say to us, that forces us to treat certain arts as better than others without truly understanding the artistic standards that some arts products are created. To turn over the Massey Commission and say, you know what? That is the trap that we're also in. These historical, institutions that have come out since the 1950s that basically are struggling with relevance this day and age. So we're suggesting we have a lot of information here. We connect with a lot of artists. We document pretty much everything we do, including our breath at times, to make sure that there is something out there. Now, in my personal life, I've been guided by an interesting article by Edward Said about, of all people, W.B. Yeats, and talking about the Irish Revolution of the early 1900s. And there were three things that have stuck with me since that, and I read this article a long time ago. One is you have to have a movement for change, and so you notice we're a cultural pluralism arts movement, Ontario. Two, you had to have then some ability to mobilize people who were interested in that change. And three, you had to have a literature of change. And that's where we're really important at, is how do we bring people together, how do we mobilize people to work together around change, and how do we provide literature that says, here are the reasons why change is needed, here are some tools that help us to bring about that change. And if I can turn it to Kevin a bit, because I think, in terms of this process here of putting this book together, Living in the Skin I'm In, we've worked with black artists, I can't remember how long, it's been a while. But suddenly, when we held a session at the NIA Center for the Arts, I guess it was before COVID, maybe 2017, 18, we were then contacted by the City of Toronto's their Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit to work with them on really documenting for the city what is happening with black artists in Toronto this day and age. And so that moved us into a path of focusing a bit more specifically, and then Kevin and I working with organizations around anti-racism training, particularly after the George Floyd murder, organizations that we need to understand blackness a bit more. So that's the focus that we had here. And I'm going to turn to Kevin for a bit to talk about the process in which, because he took the lead in terms of bringing this together. What was that like for you?
What is it still like for me? Well, I think here at SUPAMO, we tend to say yes without even thinking about what's involved in it. And initially, this was going to be an online publication. And we wanted to make sure that we were also supporting or using resources that we did not use during the time of COVID to actualize that. So we actually invited key or different persons from the Black community, primarily, or the IBPOC community, to be more specific, to contribute to the publication. There are some stellar articles that we've been using over and over again, and it was our work with the National Ballet of Canada where we wanted to provide a resource for them that led to even the idea behind the book. For me and Charles, we wrote an article that was talking about what does it mean to be black facilitators walking into primarily white-led institutions, and some of the challenges we have, not necessarily from sometimes the ED, but from the employees of those institutions who would question or the ways we facilitate, the information that we held, and the ways in which we were going to be asking for their participation, which is sometimes outside of the model that they were used to before. The process of putting this together involves a whole bunch of articles that we have used before in previous publications, like Clayton Windat's Cultural Mediation, a brief paper for organizations that want to reach those not currently represented, like Nicole Bernhardt's article, No Offense, but I'm going to talk about racism, resituating anti-racism within the diversity lexicon, why equity-driven organizations must continue to talk about race, like Anthony Morgan's Black People in Canada Are Not Settlers. It's an interesting read because here he makes up a point about black persons arriving in Canada didn't have the choice. So you settle when you have a choice. For the most part, we were chatteled, we were slaves, enslaved and brought to the Western Hemisphere. And what does it look like when we start to begin to understand the complexities of that in relationship to the word calling a settler? Settler means that you have a choice in where you settle and how you want to settle. And he's arguing that black persons in this particular country and in the West didn't have that choice. A really, really interesting read from that particular standpoint. And so the first part in section 1, which is basically a subtitle of Culture, Racism, and Black History, ends with Black Presence in Canadian Art, which is a piece by Charles Smith. And again, this guy. And it's looking at, again, the presence of black contributions to Canadian art. I've been arguing a lot about when you close your eyes when you think of Canadian culture, often represented in that particular reality or vision of Canadian culture are never ever black persons. So for me, it was really interesting putting the book together because I wanted to make sure it was a diverse set of voices that were amplifying the conversation around, I would like to say, not blackness, but blacknesses. Mm-hmm. That even within blackness, there are diversities of blackness. Charles and I use this a lot, mm-hmm. that I'm born in Jamaica, came here when I was 15 going on 16. He is not born in the Bahamas, though his parents have a Bahamian lineage, but he also grew up in New York or in America, whereas I grew up here and then went to work in America. So even the idea of how we actualize ourselves as black persons are similar, but at the crux of it are also different. And so what are some of those differences and how we can begin to broaden the conversation around what it means to be a black person. So the book also addresses these particular things as part of the context of living in the skin that we're in. Wow, there's a lot here. I was curious about not just having the voice of artists, or again, facilitators, cultural workers, but also arts administrators, because I knew that there were not many black arts administrators across the country. And so we have like a contribution here from Regine Cadet, who is no longer at Theatre Passe Muraille, but up until recently was at Theatre Passe Muraille as a general manager there, and also who's French and also coming from Haiti, who had worked with Mai in Montreal. So we wanted to also bring different voices to the conversation and different diverse experiences from the art sector. Charles, I wonder if you could talk about which piece for you is resonating in all of these?
That's like asking me who my favorite musician is. It's like, okay, who am I listening to now? I can't really focus in on whose piece because I get amused and amazed. So reading Brainerd's piece, for example, becomes really, because again, it opens up history. And as you were talking about earlier, and it reminds me of when we published George Eliot Clarke's piece about the Canadian stage, Canada is not white and neither is Canadian theater, where he too dug into the history of our presence in theater. And, for Brainerd and Robert Small, saying, hey, that we have been creating for quite some time. And, that's just part of who we are. So why is this ignored is really impressing me. And also with some of the younger, what amazes me is that, we have some of the elders in our community like Brainerd, and then some younger artists as well contributing to this dialogue. And really focusing in on what are the challenges they're facing. I arrived in Toronto in 1980. I was then very involved with Black Theatre Canada. I also started a community arts program called Black Perspectives in Regent Park. I think it was probably one of the first community arts programs in the country because there weren't funding categories for community arts at that time. What amazes me is that I'm hearing fairly similar stories now that I heard then. Why Black Theatre Canada ended, right? Because of the racism it faced from funders at that time. I was in the room. I heard some of the ugly comments that the artistic director, and we'll hear later in the afternoon today, some of the matriarchs in Black theater and the struggles they've gone through to present their work. So to me, articles by, Coco Murray, for example, her work in dance become really quite powerful. the work of Karen Carter in visual arts, right? The sense of, and I remember, a conversation I had a while ago with some artists around the misunderstanding of a person's artistic work who happened to come from the Caribbean. There was just too much color and too much dynamics, and totally missing the environment out of which the artist was coming from. And I don't know if you've not been there, but I have, and it's a colorful environment you go down in those parts of the world. So if art is supposed to reflect our lives, then what is it we are bringing forward? And this is why I find it's hard to say a certain article is more important to me than any other, because it's the diversity of articles and the experiences and the identities. One of the things that we really struggle with SEPAMO as an advocate is to say pluralism, it moves us beyond anti-oppression, anti-racism, moves us beyond, because it talks about a transformative world in which we hope to be able to get at, where we will see things very differently, where we won't have to struggle about racism anymore, where we won't have to struggle about oppression anymore. And when these artists come out in the way they are in this volume, it really pushes us in that direction, to say we have to deal with not just, as Kevin said, anti-blacknesses, right? Because we come from different parts of the world, we have different cultural understandings and so on. One of the pieces that I wrote that's in here is around theater. And I was based on a request that was made for me from the Theater Center some years ago about a play that was about the Herero in what is now Namibia, and the genocide that took place. And a number of critics, kind of said, well, the work seems to border on stereotypes and that kind of thing, without reading into the intentions of what the playwright wanted, which was astounding. These were white critics writing in places like the Globe and Mail and that kind of stuff. And so it was like, and so what does this say to society? The playwright doesn't know what she's doing. The actors don't know what they're doing, that kind of stuff. So we had to refute it in many ways to say, hey, wait a minute. The playwright made it really clear. How did you miss it? What's going on here? How did you not understand the transhistorical nature of what this play is about? How did you miss the point that, at some point somebody could write home to their family in Germany about their experiences in Namibia, and the ones in Namibia, the Herero, obviously, did not write home, they were home. So those are questions around who's got the gaze, where is it pointing, why, and how do we begin to counter it with historical evidence that makes it clear that we've been here for some time and have been creating during that time.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to provide context also to those two particular pieces that Charles is talking about, is that it exists in our section called Black Music in Canadian History. Robert Ball is a sixth-generation Canadian black person from both a Jamaican background and a Canadian black background. What's even beautiful about him talking about his family's history is that these were the ball singers that was very instrumental in the British AME church that actually toured across Canada during its inception early in the days. And one of his main concerns was the question, how long have you been here? Because if you think about it, what's really interesting about it is that for him, his black lineage goes back even longer than some quote-unquote white Eurocentric lineages has. But he was still faced with that question when his family is also instrumental in building what is the music, the lineage of music across this particular country. It's a really beautiful piece, and if in hindsight, I wish I had asked them to write more, but there was no budget to compensate them for that. But it's a really beautiful snippet of sort of the challenges that he has gone through, but he's also in music today, and actually he's in a show right now on dealing with, I can't remember the name of it, Motown, but it's for Stage West in Calgary. And Brainerd's piece is also interesting as well, because this is Nathaniel Dett, who is lauded in America for his choral compositions. And Brainerd talks about in that particular piece how sometimes you see Nathaniel Dett in Canada and no one even know who he is. This is someone who went to Oberlin College, you know, one of the conservatory for music at Oberlin College, actually, and who is laid to rest here in the Niagara region. And many people don't really actually understand the implication of his work as a Canadian composer of Black lineage. So what's resonating for me also in these particular pieces is the sort of connection it has with different persons and people from the community who are also doing work as well. And for me, it was really beautiful to speak what we also had to do, which was a great invitation from Akua Delfish and Anik Jordan, and also Brainerd, is that they didn't have the time to write pieces, so they asked about doing an interview. Now, the challenge was transcribing an interview. Of course, their pieces are way longer because the interview was sometimes an hour and a half of just really rich and beautiful material that I couldn't have now said, oh, you're only going to get 1,000 words. So they arrive in the book as longer pieces in conversation, but they were really rich. For me, it was really beautiful because Anik and Akua, Anik is also a multidisciplinary performance artist, a budding artist in the Canadian scene right now. Has been presented by many galleries and stuff. And Akua is in communications and also still dancing. And I taught them when I came to Canada in Malvern. I saw a lot of what I see now in them are what I taught. It's like I see this lineage of accepting Caribbean culture as an integral part of how they experience themselves as first generation or second generation Canadians. So to see that lineage continue for me is really, really beautiful, as it is beautiful to actually have contributions from Dan Roberts or from like Dwayne Morgan, who was instrumental in my own career when we worked together in Up From the Roots back in the day in Malvern. I will always, Dwayne is a great, great friend of mine, and I don't think I'd have been sitting at this table in the way that I am if it wasn't for his influence and his support and on many conversations we've had around poetry and where poetry intersects with dance. Funny enough, when I first met Charles, that was the conversation we had, and I was like, oh, please. I've been doing this forever. I've been doing this since I actually was 16 with Dwayne, you know, and to see his growth and where he has come with his work as well, it was actually really, really interesting. So the piece also, it ends with beautiful things like a glossary of terms around terms that is looking at equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and then also with like anti-Black racism resources. So,
Sure. Yeah.
final thoughts.
Well, I'm not so sure about final thoughts, but thoughts, and we'll see how this goes. One of the things that I just find really curious this day and age is, and we talked about this a bit, the homogenization of, and I'm going to borrow from, and you can see it online, when we had our session on indigeneity and the arts, Wanda Nanabush, basically said, this homogenous, she didn't say it quite this way, but it was this homogenization is problematic. And she said she's Mohawk. And so we have to, and as Peril pointed out today, can we name the nations whose territories we are on, depending on where we are, if we're in Taikaranto, or if we're in Ottawa, or if we're in Kitchener-Waterloo, or if we're in Quebec, et cetera, et cetera. How do we get out of this thing of just saying they're Black people? There are Black peoples. And that comes through in the arts, and that's the goal of how do we get out of these ways in which government, in particular, defines our identities and cuts us off at public acknowledgement of the expansive nature of who we are. And that's the purpose of these documents, is to continue to shed light on how we grow, on where we are, on the disciplines that we are in, on the way we play with the arts, as every artist should. One of the things that I found interesting in the article that I contributed here was this notion of resolution versus discomfort. And, Duke Ellington, I think, said it best. The dissonance in jazz is because the dissonance in the lives of Black artists, right? If art is supposed to reflect our lives, and if our lives are in turmoil, then expect our work to show that. And so audiences, people need to become comfortable with being discomforted. I wouldn't say you get comfortable with that, but to know that that is part of the process. Because art reflects upon the world that we're in. It's our imaginaries that give us the opportunity to examine the societies that we live within, and through that to be able to say, well, why are we living this way? Can we make some changes? In the work that I do, for example, I do focus on a lot of historical characters in the black community who have not been honored. I remember my recent work is around Julius Eastman, an amazing black queer composer, choreographer, musician, singer, etc. Now coming back, thank God, but I can't imagine how he survived in the time that, well, we know basically he did not fare well in the time that he existed. So bringing his work to light so it gives others encouragement is really important. But it also brings to light a very interesting aspect about minimalism in the United States, that one of the key artists was Julius Eastman, whom we do not hear about in the same way we hear about Philip Glass, Stephen Reich, Meredith Monk, Terry Riley, and so on. This is not to diminish the work that they do. They do great work. What about Julius Eastman? Why do we not hear him? Same way that we don't hear about who started the Stonewall protests. The same way when we talk about the current movement on Me Too movement, we don't hear that it was actually started by a black woman. Why do we get erased when we start these things? The same way in Canada, when we talk about human rights, we do not talk about Adrienne Carey Shadd. We do not talk about Viola Desmond. Now we've put her on a $10, $20 bill, I can't remember. But anyway, since we don't carry paper anymore, that's the thing that is so critical to us, is not being erased and showing that actually a lot of our work has been foundational to the creative world that we live within today.
Thank you. I think I would like to end by offering or arts organizations on this particular Zoom and in general the importance of actually documenting their work, the importance of actually finding it and making it happen beyond the sort of Eurocentric ways of just, I mean, we did a book, but I mean, there's many ways to do it, as we know that organizers, and for IBPOC artists and organizations, organizational brain drain and people moving from one organization to a next is a real thing. And I think in documenting, you begin to create a lineage of your work and your contribution along the way. I also want to end, I see a question before I end. I see here a question says, which types of institutions do you feel most commonly participate in the erasure of blackness in art and refuse to acknowledge black presence and black history in the arts? Where do you find complicit corporate cultural amnesia is most automatic?
Ooh.
Wow. Okay. I think, I think it's systemic.
Yeah.
I think it's systemic in ways in which many organizations don't think about it. They don't think about, I often say, as a black facilitator, I will not facilitate any other way than I know how to. You have to have music. I have to walk in and talk patois as well because I'm a Jamaican facilitator as well. And you cannot take offense if you hear an accent because we have a country that is English and French. But it should probably, as I like to say, begin to acknowledge the multiplicity of languages that should be honored as part of the official stance. And what are we holding on to when we think about these two official languages? When we talk about our diversity in our cultural and ethnic backgrounds, what are we holding on to? Because I think it's colonial. So I think part of the erasure we see in black arts and presence has to do with the systemic ways in which black arts and black arts aesthetics is being assessed based on Eurocentric values. It's also being assessed without enough information from those assessing it around the ways in which we practice our arts differently. I think like indigenous practices, we do not see a separation between what is dance and theater and music and everything. All the pantheon of what is performing arts exist as one, and we create within that particular structure. I can be very open with you and say that you see this sort of erasure even when organizations like my own Cassia Dance has applied for grants. right? Where you hear, oh, take this out of because it should go into operating budget, and you're like, we don't receive operating funding. So right away, like for me, I just finished an application and I had to push back to that particular assessor and say, what you're suggesting is actually oppressive. It's bureaucratically oppressive because you're telling me that I should not think ahead for the next 2 years of what I will need that particular funding for, because you don't fund, because it is normally in an operating byline. So that's just many ways in which it's, again, automatic, because many organizations and many funding bodies are not thinking about it in that particular way. So there is also an invitation to think about funding and think about assessment and think about understanding artistic practice in a really diverse and pluralist way. And that's just one offering I would have.
I can just add to that. It came to mind because the question is around specific institutions. I'm not going to name an organization, but I will name a form. We honor George Balanchine, right, as the ballet master, without looking at whom he appropriated from, right? Catherine Dunham and other black choreographers. It comes out through research done by people like Brenda Dixon Gothschild, or through Alicia Milliken, who's in this publication, or through Thomas DeFranz. So it comes through black bodies. And it's clearly documented when he was in contact, why he was in contact, why he chose to use black bodies the way he did for contrast's sake, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, we're not seeing that same articulation, at least I've not, and I'd be happy if someone were to show it to me, from white critics of ballet. To say, wow, it was great what Balanchine did. However, let's be honest about where the roots came from, right? Let's be honest about where the roots came from. And so that is really critical when we think about the influence that Balanchine has had on contemporary ballet, a ballet that's being performed in the world today, right? Mm-hmm. So I just want to leave that with you. Because, how we engage in work, I mean, I think of minimalism music, and sometimes I listen to a lot of jazz, and I kind of say, well, I listen to Mal Waldron way ahead of, most of these other musicians who came around in the late 60s and 70s and said, sounds minimalist to me in terms of how the definition is, but why is he not recognized in that way? Mm-hmm. So we can go on and on. And that's the point of documentation, is to make sure that our voices are heard, because the erasure is so profound, and as Kevin said, backing the Eurocentric paradigm to say greatness comes from the West, and then there's the rest.
Yeah, and I think I'd add one last thing. As a classic example, if you look at the economic development funding at the city and where Caravana lands in funding in comparison to where other things land, Caravana brings in the most GDP for the entire province, and you can look at where it lands in the funding. Or you could think about the ways in which IBPOC arts organizations and practices are never linked to economics. It's always linked to, this is what they do, and they do it in these particular ways. It's never linked to the actual economics that exist in this particular country. And I think that's part of the systemic things that it's an invitation for many things, many organizations and people in different spaces where decision-making is made to think about. I want to leave, as we end this session that's now way too long, but this is what happens when you get me and Charles on a table talking about things that we're passionate about. I want to lead with a quote that comes from Cornel West in his New Cultural Politics of Difference paper, and it's something that we use a lot. It actually is in the book as well. And it says, in this sense, there can be no artistic breakthrough or social progress without some form of crisis in civilization. I think we're at that crisis right now. A crisis usually generated by organizations or collectives that convince ordinary people to put their bodies and lives on the line. There is, of course, no guarantee that such pressure will yield the results one wants, but there is a guarantee that the status quo will remain or regress if no pressure is applied at all. Part of our process with Supamo POC, Pluralism for Organizational Change, Warren Garrett in the first year, who I was sort of facilitative lead for, was begging this question about how do we begin to think about the arts with indigeneity at the center. And it was some of the best lessons I've learned. I learned a teaching with our partnership with Impact Festival in September was from a land acknowledgement where I can't remember her last name, but her first name was Carol, was speaking about the medicine wheel and each of it representing a particular season, and even suggesting that fall is for movement, and so winter is for rest, and so spring is for renewal. And these ways of incorporating indigenous teachings, indigenous way of learning into even the artistic practice was an interesting way to begin to think about the ways in which we need to work more collectively, but also with more informed information moving into the future.
And I'll leave you the last word, Charles, because I know you guys have to move on to organize the next part of this event.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we talk about who's engaged and who's not around issues of climate change, because we always have to look around and see, who has time, who has resources, and who's connected to the issues. And, like we're seeing with COVID, the impact upon low-income communities, many of which are racialized, in schooling, for example, with children, or people who have to go to work because they have no other way, they must, that kind of thing. So the question to me is a question of what time do people have to really get engaged? This is not to say that people aren't, and we know people who are. The other aspect, I think, though, is what are the tools that the arts can use? And here, I'm going to do a little plug for Atlantic Ballet. We've worked, Wind in the Leaves has, and I know Kasha Dance previous has, but a while ago, and I think this was a Canada Council grant, they created something called Collab. Collab was an online platform where you could be in two different locations and still be in real-time rehearsal or even performance. So I have to go that far. And the notion was, look at the footprint it could remove if there were more platforms like that, so that people could actually say, okay, you're in BC, you're in Vancouver, and I'm in Toronto. Let's find a mutually agreeable time. You don't need to travel over here. I don't have to travel over there. And that's the questions of where we go in the future, is where technology can help us, but also the sense of how do we get information into communities that are not engaged right now around climate change issues. The immediate issue, I think, of paying rent, putting food on the table, taking care of kids, etc., almost makes it impossible to reach to something that may seem not so immediate to people.
And yet they can affect their own communities through what they do, through their artistic work, through their community involvement, through their volunteering, through their... And so we have to work together, those of us who have access to certain things, to share them. And I hear what you're saying. I don't know any easy solution to it, but I hear exactly what you're saying.
The sad part, and COVID is teaching us this, is, and I've heard this years ago when I think it was, I can't remember what year it was, where there was this big G20 and there was a climate change conference around it involving mayors from around the world. And there was one prof out of Queens who said, no country is going to go ahead with a massive change. They're all going to go ahead together or not at all. And he was asked why. And he said, the first country that decides it's really going to have a radical climate change agenda, every other country is going to steal its business. We have to de-link things like economics from things like climate change. It's driving us. We have to de-link the economy from COVID, because clearly this up and down, open, close, is all driven by the economy. Rather than, let's get this under our control and let's keep people safe. First and foremost, you think that would be the priority. Let's keep people safe. But every time we hear, we got to get back to work, kids have to get back into school and all that. I'm not saying they don't, but are we going to throw them into circumstances where we're not certain of what the outcomes are? And then we end up with more people with health issues and so on and so forth. And the same with climate change. We've got people who are flying into space for 10 minutes. Really? Right? And what happens to many people who are losing their homes because they can't work during this time, or having difficulty putting food on the table? You see the lineups of cars in places like Texas to get food.
We'll leave it at that for now. Thank you both for your time and for this event, and we shall talk again.
Thank you. Okay.